Right, David. In the context of Enlightenment, you mentioned the human rights and freedom of speech. Can you elaborate more on that?
Well, I don't think I uh, dwelt on freedom of speech as much, but I'm happy to do so. But the Enlightenment culminates with the human rights instruments of the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the American Declaration of Independence. And they're the prototype for the human rights instruments at the end of the Second World War, such as the UN Charter and Declaration, the European Convention on Human Rights, and all this stuff, and various regional constitutions. And it has become a form of secular humanism that people have fundamental rights, right to life, prohibition against torture, humane integrating treatment, various due process protections of liberty, um, fairness of procedures in terms of civil processes, and particularly in terms of criminal processes, the presumption of innocence. And these are, in a sense, the secular glue that has traditionally held civil society together. But it's completely falling apart, or has fallen apart, for a variety of reasons. And those of us, including myself, who have been committed to it are reaching a point that, not quite of futility, but of the belief that the whole discourse is being cheapened. Now, one of the problems, going back to what I said earlier, and Chomsky said, is the post-truth thing, which is moral relativism. My point of view is as good as point of view is yours. All points of view are equal, and that leads the denigration of fundamental values or absolute archetypal values, archodionic values, that this is true and that's it. If you're saying, no, there are two sides to every story, there are two types of views, everything's relative or culture specific, and academics are enormously responsible for this nonsense of relativism. There was a leading academic in the Sudan who I think put it reasonably well when he said, look, irrespective of the fact that you should tolerate our culture-specific way of doing things, that does not mean we're not immune from international scrutiny. Does not mean we're not immune from international scrutiny. In other words, all relativistic cultural practices have to be set against a Bell Star standard, a standard of human rights protection. Now, so cultural relativism has undermined the viability of human rights, but it isn't the only thing. The other thing that's kind of completely gone out the window is because we've had this recrudescence of state authoritarianism and fascism all around the world now, these people have no respect for human rights. I mean, the Catalan guys I wrote about this, who had an independent referendum in Catalan, the Spanish brought them back for treason-related charges. I mean, the whole thing's a farce, a joke. And this Donna Luan, spokesperson for the Spanish government, I called her the poisonous Castilian Donna in an article that they won't publish. She referred to them in advance of the trial as the convicted. Now, it's not funny, because the process has made up its own mind. So trials are now like a reversion to the 1930s, show trials, preordained conclusions, particularly in authoritarian neo-fascist states. And that includes much of the world at this stage, particularly when political persecutions go on. And of course, sorry, I need some water. Part of it as well is the traduction and the dismissal of dissenting people. And I wrote an article called Subversion of Subversion by Subversives, which kind of cuts on this point, which is those people who should be celebrated, human rights lawyers, journalists, dissidents, people who uncover the truth, whistleblowers, are now part of the rogues gallery of infamy when the crypto-fascists have taken over.
Where did you write this article?
It's in a thing called Cassandra Voices, which is a public intellectual website, which had been set up by a former student of mine called Frank Armstrong. He's had it for a year and a half. And it's about the only vector of public opinion in Ireland which is approaching things with appropriate levels of seriousness outside of technical journals, which are often context specific. I write a monthly thing. And therefore, if you are standing up for human rights, you have become in this rather odd paradigm shift. You've been moved from the subversive and now a criminal. So that those who are the just, the righteous, the truth tellers, are now the criminals. And we, the crypto-fascist, state-appointed judges, even though we're the criminals, we don't hold ourselves accountable for our criminality. And this has become an utterly bizarre universe where austerity paradigms in Ireland are violating the right to housing by evicting and repossessing people and throwing people out in the streets. It's an absolute national scandal. I've been involved in lobbying the housing organisations and representing them in the Tyrrell estate and through some of the kind of fledgling NGOs. And I'm not uncritical about them. I've written several times. I'm not the only person. I'm the Master of the Irish High Court, Edward Honan, has done a tremendous job stopping or at least delaying some of these evictions. But it's not so much that you have an untrammeled right to housing. It is that you should not, without a consultative process, be arbitrarily evicted with nowhere to go. And more to the point, were you responsible for your debt in the first place? And who are you paying back to? You're paying back to a government which bailed out criminal bankers, criminal lawyers, who are massively mired in debt, set up a bandit organisation called NAMA, the National Asset Management Agency in Ireland, for the purpose of money laundering the debts of very rich people, who are some of the power brokers of Ireland, and expecting everybody else to pay for it. Now, this is cobblers, true, but it's just beneath contempt. But that's a thing just to say, because they're getting away with it, and they're in authority. So those in authority, mired in debt, are evicting people for small amounts of money. And therefore, concepts of civic and social economic justice, housing, healthcare, and so on, are going out the window. And the point I mentioned the last thing, that Donald Trump said recently, we want to privatise the NHS. Well, goodbye to healthcare as well. So the social economic rights, always precarious, housing, healthcare, minimum standard of living, with the withdrawal of neoliberalism of all forms of human support, are now being taken away, except in countries which believe in that, such as the Nordic countries and the European countries. What about the civil and political rights? Well, if you speak up about it, freedom of speech, well, that's not necessarily working anymore, because the right wing control a lot of the agenda. You won't be allowed to say certain things. I've been on radio, you can say this. It's true, you can say it. No, but it's true, you can say it. Because they're ensnared by vested interests and they don't want to upset certain apple carts. So legitimate, hard-headed criticism, proper investigative journalism, proper public intellectualism has disappeared down the toilet. And therefore, freedom of speech is not influencing opinion as much as it did. The great tradition I was brought up in of uninhibited public discourse and debating societies is now under siege and threat. But it's not just the control of the media by vested interests, it's the criminalisation of speech. In India, they've made, I wrote about this in the Dublin Review of Books, thinking an anti-governmental thought a criminal offence. Now, it's completely berserk and bizarre that certain states have. But then an Irish politician wanted to, and I didn't get through in Ireland, thank God, but he wanted criticism of a public official, which was to be a criminal offence. So we're dealing with the criminalisation of a culture of criticism, which is crazy, by state authoritarians. You can penalise people all you want, but you can't be criticised. It's like people like Bannon and Trump go into the press now with an agenda. You can't say this, I'm not answering a question from you. These are the parameters of the discussion. And so that's another aspect of it. And then other aspects of this are that the controlling of what can and cannot be said is being adjusted in legal systems when claims are deemed admissible or inadmissible Or do you have standing to say this or not? And the utilisation of technical arguments, for example, in Ireland, they say we can't declare a right to housing because of separation of powers. Well, that didn't stop the Indians, the Canadian constitutional courts, so doing. So it's ideological. They're using legal doctrine to prevent points of view or arguments from taking place that should take place, and marginalising those. And then, of course, in the colleges, those radical professors, whatever that term means, or anybody who speaks up about anything, you don't have to be a radical, you can be a conservative, are being punted off to retirement or got rid of, or so on. And then you've got, now the left are as bad as the extreme right. I'll lay my cards on the table about this. You've got these transgender academics who are not transgender people, have written about it. And they're saying that which was said by, say, an esteemed public intellectual and probably the world's leading feminist still, Germaine Greer, 30 years ago, a man who becomes a woman can never fully understand what that means, leads to her being no platformed and banned from campuses. And the ideological Stalinism and extremism of the left, of course, plays perfectly into the hands of the right at all sorts of levels in terms of the curtailment of freedom of speech. And it stops this extremism, this polarization of everything, which has destroyed human rights. There are a couple of other points I want to make. Has stopped the presentation of moderate, nuanced, balanced layers of argument being presented as the correct arguments. Now, apart from that as well, there are other questions. Torture, inhuman and degrading treatment, has become de rigueur in insidious ways because you don't see it. First of all, you're being psychologically managed and manipulated by Cambridge Analytica and targeted advertising, and they're fucking with your brains. Now, is that not a form of mental torture? It is. Torture-driven techniques inherited from the Americans and CIA are now regularly in use and invoked by police forces. Tell the truth. Make it easier on yourself. Get it off your chest. All this shit was always the case, yeah, but they've got even worse. So that which is torture, I think Christopher Hitchens consented to waterboarding, has become also part of the discourse and is not sanctioned as much as it should be. And fair procedures in civil and criminal process are out the window. And this again classic left-wing nonsense. Hillary Clinton in sex cases, because the feminist lobby is mad about these things. It's actually almost like an antediluvian argument that shouldn't be made anymore. But she says, let us reverse the burden of proof so that someone who's accused of a sex allegation, I'm sure Bill Clinton might agree with this, should have to prove his or her innocence. Now, once that comes in, then you're talking about the destruction of the presumption of innocence, the destruction of, in effect, the jury system at a certain level of proof beyond all reasonable doubt, and the undermining of due process. One final point, arising from Ireland. The protection, people say you're protecting criminals. This is crap. You're not. People accuse, because accusation or dirt has now become conviction in a certain way, if you don't give people proper procedural protections. And if the state itself, the point I'm making in the subversion article, as it is in Ireland, is a proven criminal entity, 2 police commissioners have had to resign because of their criminality. If the state itself, they're not entitled, I don't think, any longer to any measure of protection. They shouldn't be. Or undue protection, because if they're not going to play by the rules of the game, or they're not going to behave properly, why should you get rid of the rules of evidence in order to allow them to enforce criminality on other people? And that is because the concept of human rights, freedom of speech, and all of that has been destroyed by state authoritarianism, mass surveillance, image and message manipulation and control, and we're entering a dark, non-human rights age where speech and words, which I hold on to preciously, and the truth, no longer matter.